is addressing this journey in its spirit. The conversation series is intended to get very different set of panelists together on topics which can throw lights, disrupt some myths and stereotypes, and get people together to build a narrative that we all can engage in. Having said that, this particular episode has one of the most interesting topic, corporatization of NGOs. And believe you me, we've already had so many interesting, engaging comments on this topic. So really looking forward to this conversation series. I'm truly privileged to have a very rich panel here. And interestingly, as someone pointed out, it's an all-women panel. What I would request, so that you all have access to the rich experience of every single panelist, I'll request our admin team to please post the bios of the panelist in the chat. I would also urge all the attendees to use the Q&A button to post their questions. And we hope to have an engaging dialogue when we open it up during the Q&A session. So here's to a very interesting next 75 minutes together. And with that, let me first straight away come to the topic, corporatization of NGOs. What does this term mean? And that in itself, I think, will kind of get diverse views to the term and the meaning of term. May I request Nidhi to share top 3-4 points that comes to her when we talk about the term corporatization of NGOs.
Hi, Gakul. Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here, especially because, one, a very interesting topic, and as Gakul pointed out, a panel of women. I think it's a privilege to share the space with everyone out here. Firstly, I think I may start on a different note out here because I have a problem with that word corporatization. So I was looking through the dictionary and I was like, what does this word really mean if one has to go on Google and look at it? So one was that if you're converting a government-owned entity into a private, well, that definitely doesn't apply to the non-profit organization, the NGOs, right? Because we already are non-governmental organization. Our purpose is definitely very different. Second, somewhere else I was reading, it was the imposition of corporate values. Now, what are these corporate values? Why do we want to impose those values on the NGOs, right? And the third was commercialization, right? NGOs, non-profit, interchangeable words in some context, right? So if you're talking about non-profit, we are talking about the purpose behind having NGOs is very different. Then that, again, commercialization doesn't apply to us, right, to the NGOs. We human beings have this whole way of preconceived notions. We like to put everything into our comfortable definitions. And that is why we think corporatization may be a good reference to say if we want to bring in some kind of a transparency, efficiency, good governance, better practices, right? But again, if you talk about, there's a lot of question on better governance in NGOs. But without really naming any recent incidents of the corporate world, I'll just talk about something from the past in terms of the Arthur Andersen Enron incident, so there was a governance issue there, huge global governance issue, right? So who says that corporatization would not really control the governance issue and all of that, or will have a, so similarly, there are in NGOs, we have huge amount of experiences on terms of transparency, better governance, all of that. I would just say that yes, there is a need to address that. There's a need to address governance issues. There's a need to address accountability, efficiency. I won't even say there's a need to address professionalism because we NGOs are very professional, right? It is only that we are trying to compare it to a different world which works on top line and bottom lines, right? So my whole thing is that, yes, a need to talk about how can we have better impact, better efficiency, better transparency, accountability, governance and all, but can we have a different word altogether? Or can we just say that how can we have higher efficiency and governance and leave it at that and not link it to corporatization? Yeah, back to you, Kakul.
Thanks, Nidhi. Very interesting. The whole point about not boxing it in a term and kind of getting the meaning of that. Fruti, may I invite you to share your top 3-4 points?
Yeah, sure, Kakul. And, lovely to be here. Like Nidhi said, just lovely to get to know all of the other panelists. And it's great to see so many participants on the line as well. I think as I was thinking about it, I feel like there is a conventional wisdom associated with nonprofits not necessarily having structures and strong processes, kind of doing things a little bit, flying from the hip, so to speak, a bit. And I think the word corporatization has probably been thrown around because as organizations in the nonprofit space have grown, as they've evolved and matured, we are seeing a number of really terrific organizations putting in place strong structures, strong processes, hiring some really strong talent, specializing, hiring for particular expertise, for example, fundraising, communications, finance. And so I think the word corporatization kind of addresses many of these things in terms of just the structure and process that we are seeing in organizations and in nonprofits today. Having said that, I think that is where, the word is coming from in terms of what we are seeing now in terms of the evolution of the strength of structures and processes in nonprofits. Having said that, I agree with Nidhi that it is probably not the right word to use because as nonprofit leaders, this is not necessarily something that we are seeing in the corporate space and therefore saying, oh, this would be fantastic to have for nonprofits. It's actually something that we all bring and we want to create for the organizations that we run. So yeah, I think it's a word that's stemming from what was conventional wisdom about how nonprofits operate, but that itself is changing quite a bit in terms of the talent, the processes, and the structures that nonprofits have. And so it's much more about, strengthening a nonprofit on their growth journey as they have different stages of maturity and growth rather than corporatization.
Great point, Kruti. I hear you echo that voice that rather than using the term, which becomes the overarching packaging of the need to strengthen NGOs and kind of breaking the myth around the old ways of, how maybe things were, the conventional wisdom around the systems and processes and the need for that to what is the reality today and not anchoring it in with a word called corporatization. Chandrika, would love to hear your views on this.
Thank you, Kakul, and a very good afternoon to everyone. It's really a pleasure to be on this panel. I saw in the chat somebody was asking that we introduce ourselves very briefly. So I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Antara Foundation, and we're a grassroots organization, implementation organization that works on maternal and child health. So that's all I'll say about that. I think, a lot of what Nidhi and Kruti have said echoes with me, but I think where I want to start with, and I did the same thing as Nidhi, which is that I tried to get to the root, the etymology of the word to understand why this has come into use and why it is suddenly something that is being talked about. And to me, it's a little bit of what both Nidhi and Kruti referred to, which is the process of formalization, right? Because at the end of the day, a corporate entity is one that is formally recognized legally as a single entity, as a unitary entity, which means that it can act as a unitary entity. And in that sense, at one level, that's a very obvious definition. Any organization will act as a unitary entity. But I think the sentiment behind it is this process of formalizing rather than a group of people getting together to do something that matters to them. It's really putting that in a structure and putting processes in place. Now, why does that come about. And I want to actually go back to the idea of why is this being used for NGOs? Why is it that NGOs are being identified as the group that needs corporatization? And I think here it's actually useful to just remind ourselves of how different an organism we are as compared to the corporate sector. And fundamentally, when any organization, and NGOs are of different types, and I think Kriti, you and I spoke about this a little bit earlier, that there's a very wide variety of nonprofits. So it's also a misnomer to paint them all with one brush. But whether you look at big ones or small ones or new ones or old ones, the commonality here is that it is a group of people that are trying to solve problems that by definition have an element of the commons in them, which means that they're trying to solve a problem that affects more than one person. So that problem cannot be solved individually by people on their own. So in a sense, it's a response to market failure, because if it were a market, then you could, individual behavior could solve the problems that most NGOs try to attempt. But the defining characteristic of all public sector entities, and I would include the government in that, right? The idea is to actually solve the problem of the common good, sometimes common bad, right? That's the goal of what we're trying to do. And by definition, any problem of the commons is a wicked problem, which means it doesn't have a simple solution. It has multiple actors that contribute to that solution. And therefore, what becomes very difficult is to be able to measure impact in a simple way. And that is really where I think the root of all of this demand for corporatization is coming, which I also, like Nidhi, I'm not very happy with this word. So I prefer to use the word formalization, right? Which is why putting your systems in place and putting your processes in place so that you're able to function as an entity. And I think this is where the accountability point becomes important, because when you're trying to attack a wicked problem and you have multiple stakeholders involved in helping solve that problem, there is an outcome and an impact that you're trying to get to, which sometimes is easy to define, sometimes is actually not easy to define at all. And I think everybody has frozen on my screen.
Chandrika, you are clear? Can
you hear me?
Yes, Chandrika,
okay,
we can hear you. Okay, for some reason I can't somehow see all the videos, but I think so just coming back to what I was saying, once there is a multi-pronged effort at solving a problem and there is funding, the intermediary that goes between the funding and the impact is either the government or it is, in this context, a nonprofit. And so there is a very strong accountability element. And I can speak for myself that as somebody responsible for the funds that are coming into the Antara Foundation, there is a huge amount of responsibility to ensure that they are deployed effectively, that they're deployed responsibly, that the organization is doing what it says it wants to do, and that we're being very careful about building the systems and processes that we need to actually meet those standards. And I would actually argue that for nonprofits, those standards are in many cases much higher than they are for the corporate sector, because you have to focus much more on the input side because the output side is harder to measure. So it's actually something that is driven from the need to not just show impact, but also be responsible custodians of the resources that are coming in to show that impact. And you can't do it alone, which is why that ecosystem becomes important. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you, Chandrika. Some very, very good points made. And I take away formalization. I take away the linkage between the input and the impact, the funds and the impact, and the need for formalization to solve that wicked problem that I think that's something that we are all trying to address. Matilda, in the same spirit, if I can request you to give a brief introduction to yourself and then share your insights. And then I will circle back to Kriti and Nidhi in the next conversation point to also introduce themselves before they address that. Thank you. Yes, Matilda.
Thank you, Kakul and ISDM, for inviting me to this amazing panel. And I am Matilda Lobo. I head corporate social responsibility at IndusInd Bank. So first of all, a very good evening to everybody attending this panel, and also to my nonprofit partners. Without your support as a corporate, we wouldn't be able to showcase or achieve the type of impact that we have been able to achieve as an organization. And what I would want to bring to the table is that each of the pillar, be it the India Inc., the corporate, the public sector, the government, or the non-profit organization, which is the civil society, each of this pillar is critical in the entire ecosystem, right? In a country like India, where we have so many social issues, with the population of India being one of the highest population today, it is critical that all of us work efficiently, right? And we all are interconnected. So purely coming from the word corporatization, I also personally don't align with corporatization. The word is, there's nothing about a corporate and a non-corporate. Over the last decade or so, we have seen the entire development sector also evolve, right? With the CSR policy coming in place. Yes, there have been challenges at every aspect because the governance, compliance, etc. has increased multifold, and it's increased multifold even at the corporate end. If you look at from the government perspective, MCA, and even from the corporate perspective, the amount of governance and compliance, especially after Jan 21, has increased multifold. Is purely because I think the funds are so scarce in the country, right? Even when it comes to the government budget to allocate to education or to health, there are such limited budget. So how can we collectively, ensure that that particular scarce fund is optimally used so that we can reach more and more underserved people and be part of the entire social change or solve those problems? So purely, I think if you look at that, even in the corporate, you look at it that efficiencies have to be bought in, right? In terms of capacity building, investing in people, investing in process systems. And the same thing I would say as non-profit organizations, as we have that audacious task of delivering social change, to some extent, we need to also start working on building capacity, looking at systems and processes, looking at what we have been able to deliver. Digital access, M&E, information, database, this all will help us to collectively ensure that we are moving the needle in the development sector. So I purely look at it from that aspect, not only for the development sector, but also for the corporate sector, right? Because even in the past, we were purely doing grant making. We would give money. At the end of it, yes, all of us are accountable. We are all personally, it comes down to intentions, right? What are our intentions as organizations, as individuals? And all of us, I'm sure, have the best of intentions of doing social good. It's just taking a notch level up where we collectively ensure that we get the best out of whatever limited resources we have. So I look at it purely in terms of institutionalizing, formalizing, and making it better for all of us.
Thank you so much, Matilda. Indeed, as you said, this entire need to build capacities, and this is not just for the social sector, the civil society, but across all the three pillars. And if I may throw in a word, which is quadruple helix, including the academia into the foray, while they very much can be part of these three pillars. But I think the kind of wicked problems we are looking at solving, not just at the national level, but also at the global level, in the current context, it becomes so very critical. Kruti, moving on, just to dig deeper, and let's park the term corporatization aside for a moment and go with the spirit of what we all have kind of agreed upon, and looking at this as a formalization journey to be able to achieve all that we were talking about. I would love to understand from you, what are the kind of pitfalls, what are the kind of challenges, enablers, if you could list top 3-4 points that come to you, which are very critical for NGOs to look out for when they are going through this journey, and would be very good if you could share any kind of examples, because you did mention while talking that you've seen the conventional wisdom, you've seen how NGOs have moved far over the last, let's say, timeline. So would love to hear your perspective on that. And yes, please do introduce yourself as well briefly.
I'm the founder and CEO of People, which is an education nonprofit. We work with government school systems to improve student engagement in the classroom and the delivery of education. So a lot of our work is with is both at the micro level, running exemplar schools to show what is possible, and at the macro level where we work at scale with large government systems to be able to leverage their administrative machinery, their resources, their budgets to be able to drive change with regard to quality of delivery of education. So that's about me. That's a little bit about, well, not about me, but about people. I think to answer your question, maybe some of the as I think about the stages of growth of an organization, I think the first one is just pure survival, right? I remember, and maybe I can just talk about it from the lens of what I've seen at people, right? As we've kind of grown from a much smaller organization to a larger organization now. I think the first one is just survival, right? Where you really just have to get your funding in order before you can start thinking about growth, sustainability, and so on. And I remember, this is where, a nonprofit, no matter how, strong the leadership team is or how good the talent is, or how, credible and impactful the programs might be, there is such uncertainty with regard to just funding decisions, whether it is with CSR or whether it is with foundations. And so, you just kind of have to keep persevering. In our case, I remember, early 2020, we had, a CSR funding decision fall through at the very last minute. Right. And that created a lot of uncertainty for us with regard to our cash flow and, security of operations for us. And so I think, the first one is just pure, funding security for me as a nonprofit leader to be able to sleep at night. Because first and foremost, I need to make sure that cash flow is secure and salaries can be paid. And then the second, I think once, you have some stability there, and again, there is a point around diversifying your funding. That is the next stage of growth where, you can't be over-reliant on foundations, given regulations and given uncertainties around regulations. And you also have to be careful about, the mix between international foundations, CSR, HNIs, retail. And so starting to then consider, going from survival to then thinking about what's your fundraising mix so that you are being balanced as an organization and not overly dependent on one source of funding. And again, just from a security perspective. The second thing I would say is, talent, I think, is the other big driver in terms of, what it means to actually, put structures, processes, and help an organization grow in terms of getting to what they, getting to kind of greater reach and strength of program delivery. And here's, a couple of experiences that I would share, right? Here, at People, we really, I as the CEO, I think for me, I say this consistently, but for me, the secret sauce of our organization is really the people that we have. It's really the talent that we're able to attract and retain. And I place so much value on just the individuals that we have on the team, but also how the team really functions more broadly. So given that, I think as a nonprofit, it isn't easy in your initial stages of growth to really be able to attract strong talent, right? And then as you think about also diversifying your talent base and looking at new sources of talent, you would look at, folks that have grassroots and field experience. You would look at folks that are more experienced program managers. You may look at folks from, the corporate sector who want to come in and make a difference. I think it's very important to be clear about what type of talent is needed for the organization. What is the mix of skill sets? And then as a nonprofit, this is one huge learning I have had, and I think it gets to Chandrika's point, the importance of mission alignment for each person on the team when you hire them. There was a point when I thought, the skills are most important, right? But I've begun to realize how critical it is for everybody on the team to really be mission aligned, because the motivation has to come from deep inside, because it's not going to be an easy journey. And so when I have interviewed folks that want to come from the corporate sector, and I ask them, why do you want to join? And the answer is work-life balance. That is not that is not something that a wicked problem addressing a wicked problem is that's not the way that one should think about careers in nonprofit. I think also a huge learning I've had is that when you do get folks in and you grow as an organization and you start developing specific expertise areas like finance or fundraising or monitoring and evaluation, I think that's when you again start bringing on board folks that are specialists and potentially folks that come in from the corporate sector. But I think one needs to be aware of when folks do come in from the corporate sector, I think it's very important for them to bring a huge dose of humility to the work, because while skill sets may be transferable, such as program management or managing teams, there is huge learning. So, after 15 years in the corporate sector, when I moved, I think for me, there was so much that I had to really learn and pick up. And I think it's important for people to kind of keep that in mind in terms of being open to learning, realizing that, having worked in the corporate sector in a certain setting, having become a leader does not automatically mean that you will be successful in the nonprofit space, right? It does require a lot of learning. And then the third thing I would say is just impact measurement. Again, as you grow, one of the pitfalls is that you're so busy growing that you forget the reason that you're doing all of this in the first place, which is to have change on the ground. And for us, it's change in the classrooms, it's change with teachers in schools. And so making sure that you keep an eye on communicating impact and impact measurement is critical. So just to, summarize, I'm sorry, I've gone on for a bit, but I think for me, the three considerations to keep in mind is just, securing funding. Second, just having a clear talent strategy in place. And third, making sure that there is always an eye on impact measurement and monitoring.
Thank you so much, Kriti. With these three wise pearls, if I can move on to Nidhi. And Nidhi, you've also spent over 2 rich decades in the social sector. I would request you to introduce yourself, but very interesting. One more question that I would love you to address while you're sharing your top 3-4 perspectives on the possible pitfalls, challenges, and enablers is any view you see from ecosystem side as we want this formalization to happen. We spoke about the ecosystem, and the wicked problem is in the context of ecosystem. So anything that comes to your mind as what the ecosystem, other actors need to support the NGOs in this formalization journey. So love to hear your thought on that, Nidhi.
So I'm the CEO of NASCOM Foundation, and NASCOM Foundation is a part of the NASCOM ecosystem where we work with the whole agenda of using technology to reach the last mile. Sometimes I feel somewhere we are not a typical NGO and we are not a typical corporate. So somewhere I think we are in between out here, and I kind of, everything everybody has been saying here, I kind of relate to it quite a bit. What Kriti covered a lot of points when it comes to, what are the pitfalls, what are the learnings, everything. And I'm just going to repeat some of that. But I feel since I spent, like, as you said, more than 2 decades in the sector, I've seen the formalization started many, many years ago, right? So it's not something that suddenly that today a donor is asking and we're starting it today and we all are figuring out how to formalize it, right? There's a huge amount of professionalism which came into the sector long back, right? I remember when I joined the sector, people thought, are you a volunteer? And I had to say, no, it's a paid job, right? But I think we've come a very, very long way in the last couple of decades out here. One of the things that I think somewhere I feel the challenge has been the confusion in our mind, right? What I said in the earlier answer also, it's important that we accept our identity as a nonprofit organization and do not try to confuse it with being somebody else, just because there's an expectation from the other side that we should be that, right? So we have two founders of nonprofit organizations out here, right? And I think I'm sure they will agree that they must be keeping that identity very carefully out there while they're trying to match the needs of the donors and everything else. So I think that's a must, that we continue to, keep our identity. And I think what is really a need out here is which is again something which has grown over the years, but a part of this formalization is a long-term thinking. We are so driven by our hearts in the sector, so driven by our hearts, right? So much passion out here. But are we putting a strategy together? Maybe all the large organizations are. There are more medium and small organizations than the large ones, right? Are we putting a 5-year plan, a vision? Are we putting a strategy together? What I've also seen a change over the years, which is pretty positive. 20 years back, actually, I'm not too sure which side is the good side here. 20 years back, it was a lot of multitasking, right? It was not putting resources in the organization into compartments. The same person will do program management, the same person will do fundraising, the same person may do MIS, right? There's a good side to that also. But then as the sector is growing, the organizations are becoming large. It's important to have specialists into everything. And I can see that the sector is going towards that. Even when we are recruiting a specialist in a MIS, right? We are recruiting a specialist in impact measurement. We are recruiting a specialist in program management. So that is where I think a lot of more professionalism, in-depth experience is coming into the sector. As far as the support from the ecosystem, I think one of the biggest thing, whether we talk about making it a more efficient sector or we talk about making it more professional or formalized, use any word out here, the biggest thing is how many donors, how many corporates out here are generous with allowing capacity building and admin expenses, right? We want impact, right? And I know when in those components we put the word impact measurement, the donor questions it, but we want to measure impact, right? We talk about more professionalism. We want the reporting that a corporate is used to in their functioning, right? They want they want fancy PPTs. But do we have enough resources? Can we pay that kind of money to our resources, right? So that's another thing. Capacity building is a very, very important part of growing in the sector. Are we investing enough money into capacity building of the organization, of the teams, of the resources? I think a little bit of openness, being generous, being mindful of the need of why an organization needs to grow, especially if you look at, and I'm talking since we at NASCOM Foundation work majorly with the corporate sector in terms of the CSR funds. My whole thing is that in the last couple of years, the compliances have increased so much, right? But the admin cost that the corporate is giving hasn't increased. So where will the organizations bring in those kind of resources to make sure that we do that kind of reporting that is expected by the government? And it's a good thing. We are expected to report. I'm not saying that. It's a very good thing that we should be reporting. It should be more efficient reporting, more detail, more transparency. But we need support out there. Without that, it's a struggle. And definitely, Kruti, what you said, there is no work-life balance out here, right? Because the same resources are now trying to work on the ground, plus increase the reporting efficiency and the way we are functioning. Yeah, that's for me.
Thank you so much, Nidhi. Yeah, very important points. We work and move towards formalization, but that also needs support to build the capacities as needed. And we need the generous and mindfulness of the donors to support that journey, especially as we are looking at, everyone is aligned and looking at the impact that needs to be generated. With that, Chandrika, can I invite you to share your top 3 points of the kind of pitfalls or enablers and any inputs on the ecosystem support needed in this journey?
Thank you, Kakul. So I actually do resonate a lot with what has been said, but there are 4 things I want to highlight, which are things that I'm dealing with right now. So they're top of mind for me. The first is very close to what Kruti was talking about, which is the issue of people. But more than that, I would like to talk about culture, right? Because the big danger as an organization grows from early stage to middle stage or is on a growth path is that you start with a group of, very committed people who have started the organization because they see a need, they want to solve a problem, whether it's for themselves and their community or whether it's for a larger group. As you grow, you start valuing, as the other panelists have said, professional skills, right? So then you start bringing in people who either have professional skills or are sort of more efficient, more corporate in terms of doing very specific tasks that the organization needs. And there, I think there is a huge danger. And it's a very difficult trade-off because the elements, the cultural elements that make the organization succeed in its early stage become harder and harder to maintain as the organization grows. Partly that is a size issue, but partly it is also because then you start thinking about, all the stuff that we've discussed, that you need a longer term strategy, you need to get resources, you need to get the right set of skills to match the right kind of needs. And I think that is a balance that is a very, very important one to strike, which is that that heart needs to stay, the mission, the passion that drives people to work in the sector. That to me is what makes this sector unique. And to lose that is a real risk. So that is the first challenge, I would say. It's important to be professional in certain ways, but it's also very important to keep that passion alive. And I also want to say that, there are only a few NGOs that have access to people with professional skills who want to work with them. Most nonprofits, particularly the ones working in, remote areas, in communities, they are doing everything themselves. And there is no access to, either the sort of resources that we're talking about, or, the very small group of organizations that actually have access even to CSR funding, because it is because of the expectations that go along with needing to get that funding. So this is a very small group we're talking about. So somewhere we have to recognize that passion and that culture and keep that alive. So that's the first one. The second is on the issue of resources. I think I want to echo Nidhi's point that there is a certain amount of investment that is needed to create an organization that can do good work. And that is not the good work in itself. It's all of the backbone of the organization. And again, speaking from personal experience, we've just gone through a period of really building some of those systems over the last few years of, the right kind of financial system, the right kind of HR system, the right kind of monitoring and evaluation system, things that would allow, that's the foundation, right? Then you can then go on and expand. So the thing to understand about administrative costs also is that they don't rise linearly with program costs. So as the organization grows, in the initial stages, it will be a higher share. Once you reach that standard where the organization is strong enough, then your overheads don't rise in the same proportion. But for funders to understand that is not always, it's not always intuitive for organizations to understand that. So I think that's an important aspect of just having the resources to build that basic capacity to raise money, to manage people, and to do that in a way that fulfills the basic minimum standards of governance that are needed. So that's the second bit. The third bit is when we are, sorry, frozen for me again. So can you hear me?
Chandrika, you're audible. Please go ahead. We can hear you.
All right, okay. The third aspect is impact. Okay, so the third aspect is impact, where we are talking about, when we talk about, what we are doing and how we're measuring what we're doing. Again, when we are linking this to the funding we get, it's very easy to focus on our activities and our outputs because that is what we control. And there's always a tension between that and what Kruti was talking about, which is why we're doing this. What is the outcome that we want? And again, and that makes us special, that makes NGOs a little bit special in terms of just even managing them, because what you have to then be able to convince all partners, everybody in the ecosystem, is that both things matter. It matters what you're doing and how you're doing it, but what also matters is what are you doing it for? And again, that's a balance that we need to strike. And the fourth balance that I think is also becoming more and more important is this balance of the partnerships that we're talking about. So there are two kinds of partnerships I want to mention. One is, of course, between funders and organizations that are implementing. And here, I think, this comes from a place of, and I'm sorry to use the word, but there's a little bit of condescension here, which is that the people who are funding think that there are some advantages to being a corporate because it is people that you recognize. It's people like us, right? Which, that's the thinking, that if people can speak the same language that we can speak, then we are more comfortable giving them money. And I know I'm kind of simplifying it enormously, but fundamentally that is where this comes from. And I think there's a huge amount of work that we as members of the nonprofit sector have to do to build those bridges with potential funders, but also with other partners to say, look, there are certain standards, but these are the realities that we work in. And so every kind of conversation has to appreciate those realities and fit into those realities. And, both Kruti and I work in organizations that work very closely with the public sector. The public sector works on a timeline and a choreography that is very different from what a corporate works on. So just making sure that there is alignment in that. And this is not about intent. I think everybody has, I assume everybody has good intention in this, but it's a question of crossing the universe. You're used to a certain universe and you're trying to talk to a different universe. And so it's maybe time to develop a new language that doesn't belong to either of the two universes, but really recognizes that both have specific realities of their own. I'm going to stop there.
Thanks, Chandrika. Very valid points. Matilda, if you could share, and again, like we've heard a lot of insights from, people who are running the NGOs and ground realities. If you could speak from the aspect of top 3 things that you see the corporates or the government, the other ecosystem players supporting in this journey, if you could share top 3 points that come to your mind.
So, yes, I think there's also a lot of generalization about what corporate have expectation and the way NGO looks at the corporate or the corporate looks at the NGO. But I don't think so that is across the board. I think the most important stuff is the mission and value alignment. So as far as the conversation is participatory, all this conversation as part of the project, details, or when you're doing the theory of change collectively, right, both together, and you are basically looking at a long-term. So at IndusInd, we look at long-term projects. We look at multi-year projects. We just don't look at grant making. And that's how the ecosystem within the corporate world also has been transitioning to, right? So when you're looking at long-term, 4 years, 5 years project, you just can't work in isolation, right? It's not about the NGO, it's not about the corporate. It's about the community that you are working for. And that's where it has to be a starting point. The moment you start focusing on the community that you're going to be working for, then all this aspect that you're saying that what will it require collectively, the NGO and us to deliver the impact or the outcome at the ground level, you will start making the ways. So in all our programs, we work a lot on the capacity building of the NGOs. We put in money for the resourcing. We don't have a cap for administrative cost at IndusInd Bank. So like I said, it has to be a participatory conversation. And then it's a very different, it's not about somebody coming with a project to you and you're just funding it. As far as you're aligned with the theory of change, you're looking at, data, information, you're looking at collaboration, convergence. I would also, I think Nidhi mentioned it, even Kruti and even Chandrika mentioned it. Also, it's very critical at what stage is the NGO at, right? So the NGO is at the initial stage, like any other corporate startup, everybody starts from putting in their own funds, the founders putting in their own funds, pulling in friends, families, closer, fundraising. Then you basically then go out to the next level of fundraising, right? After you have showcased some sort of traction and there's work which, reflects, the ability or capability of that particular nonprofit organization. Yes, CSR, because of the regulatory requirement, it's not that the corporate is interested in asking for that information, that exactly we are required to put in a CSR form 2 on the MCA every year. Now we are reaching out to the ecosystem, we are reaching out to MCA saying that, why are you insisting on the money being spent in the same year? Otherwise it gets reported as unspent. If it's unspent, you are not complied with the 2% eligibility, right? So in case of multi-year projects, how do we manage that? So these are the challenges which are there also at the corporate end. Even we did a development impact bond with the first of its kind with CSR investment. A development impact bond, pay for outcome, pay for success, is something that when the outcome is achieved after 4 years, 5 years, or 3 years, but that is not what CSR is eligible to do. They're supposed to be funding every year. So we actually structured it in such a way that we front-ended the entire payment. So when people come together with the same mission, vision, and value alignment, you can create those type of structures. And many organizations are funding capacity building today in the corporate world. Yes, maybe many of the organizations are purely looking at it from a grant making, but that transition is happening. Any change is going to take time. Change is the most difficult aspect, whether it's at the corporate. Also, critically looking at when I'm looking at the NGOs and that you're funding, is the NGO 100% dependent on us for funding, right? Because that is not good for the NGO, nor for the corporate, right? Because if tomorrow, for any reasons, there's issue on our profitability, we don't want the work which is being done by the NGO to be affected at the ground level. So it's very critical to have a mix of corporates, a mix of funding which comes in, or philanthropic capital, which is relatively unrestricted, to come in, which can support capacity, etc. But we do support. Like most of the corporates have now started putting in money for supporting capacity building. I wouldn't 100% say that just because somebody is coming from a corporate background, they come with a certain characteristic. I feel as far as this passion, the person will align in terms of the ethos, the mission, and the vision of the nonprofit organization. So I think we need to talk more, right? Talk a lot before we even structure the projects. And once the structures are put in, and when we agree on, aligning with what are we going to be tracking over the tracking or the MIS is not just to say that the NGO just needs to input some information. It's also it helps in course correction. If we see there's some challenge, when COVID happened, there's so much of course correction which happened, right? On our projects, we moved to a hybrid model in our education programs. We moved to a community-led teaching. In addition to digital, this was not possible if we are not working together. So it's not purely just entry of information and the information is just sitting somewhere. It's like both of us discussing what we need to change. Is there any support that is required? There are so many times at the end of the year, somewhere close to Jan, Feb, we see there are challenges. There was a cold wave last time in most of part of the country, right? And the interventions that were supposed to be put in place couldn't be, done by the NGO. But we did a course correction and said, okay, this cannot be done. Can we do something else? So I think the most important is we need to have a participatory discussion. It can't be a one way. It's not that I am doing I am just giving money to the NGO and the NGO is just responsible to, give everything that I ask at the, click of a button. No, that's not how it works. So we recently have been, also organizing a lot of training for our NGO partners on M&E. We had with the social stock exchange, that's the next level, right? Now we're talking about projects being listed on social stock exchange. So we had a session for all our NGO partners to understand how they can go about.
Sorry, Matilda, just interjecting in interest of
with the newness of the stock exchange.
Sorry, Matilda, just interjecting in interest of time. Extremely, extremely pertinent points. What I hear all the panelists say and resound the fact that if there is an aligned purpose and participatory approach, let's stop bucketing any pillars. It's kind of walking this journey together. I know, Kruti, you had your hand up and I'll come to you. But in interest of time, we spent a large amount of time talking about this topic of corporatization of NGOs. What's very important is in the similar way, maybe we need to talk about, social, whatever that term may be, socializing the corporates. So from that perspective, what I would really be very keen to hear from all the panelists is what are those, let's say, top 3 things that you think the corporates can learn from the civil society? And 1 minute each, if that is okay, because I do want to leave 15 minutes for Q&A. I see a lot of questions already in the Q&A chat button. So let's start with you, Nidhi. If you could just say what are those top 3 things that the corporates need to learn from the civil society?
Very quickly, I think we all have to learn from each other. Every sector has to learn from each other. We learn a lot from the corporates, yeah, definitely. Instead of saying 3 things, I'll just say 1 thing. I think the biggest thing that we bring is empathy. If that's what corporates can learn a little bit from this sector, empathy, shared value, purpose, these are things. And I think you use socialization, I would say, maybe they can learn developmentization of the corporate, and which is already happening with the ESG conversations. Right. So that is what I think we can contribute, and that is what they can learn from us. Yeah.
Thanks, Nidhi. Chandrika?
Thank you, Kakul. So I'll keep it very short. I have a 3P answer to this, which is that I think the first thing which I talked about earlier, just passion. I think that is something that I've seen so much in this sector, which I think is everybody can learn from that. I think that's a fantastic quality of the nonprofit sector. The second, I would say, is perspective, right? So I think when you're in a particular world, which is a fairly homogeneous world, you tend to get locked into one particular way of seeing the world. And I think the beauty of the nonprofit space is we see so many different perspectives at the same time. We see the corporate perspective, we see the community perspective, we see the government perspective. And I think learning that there are many different ways of looking at the same problem is incredibly valuable. And then the third P I would talk about is partnerships. I don't think there's any organization in the social sector that works without being in partnership with at least 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 other organizations and other people. So I think that having a mindset of partnerships when you're trying to attack big, difficult problems is a wonderful asset to have.
Thanks, Chandrika. Kruti?
The reason I had my hand up was when Matilda was talking, I've heard wonderful things about IndusInd's approach to CSR, genuinely, Matilda. So it's lovely to kind of see you in person. But as you were talking, what I was reflecting on is, we've had some really wonderful CSR partners that have supported us in our journeys and have been true partners. And I think there is a huge role that organizations like IndusInd and others that have been huge supporters for us and very progressive CSR minded heads can play in actually advocating what partnership looks like with a nonprofit partner. And I feel like the more I heard you speak, the more that I really wanted to share that, because genuinely, whether it is a convening or a demonstration of what those behaviors could look like, I just think that there is so much value and power in progressive CSR organizations that have that strategic long-term perspective to be able to share that with others, right? So that we build that language within the CSR space as well. And of course, as Chandrika said, there is a language that the nonprofit world also needs to live and breathe and learn from. But I think, on both sides, to have strong leaders actually advocating and kind of making that mindset shift happen and build that language of change will be amazing for the broader ecosystem. So to your question, Kakul, I think one is just, the first is, in terms of what can be learned, I think one is just the fabric of India, right? I mean, just understanding the diversity and the fabric of India through the work that a nonprofit does, right? In Madhya Pradesh, for example, 90% of schools are located in rural areas. The difference between rural urban is so, so immense. We are, working in Chhattisgarh this year, and, predominantly tribal, right? Again, the challenges are so different. And I think the more that I go on to feel, the more that I actually absorb the fabric of India, the diversity that we have as a country. And that is, so enlightening to see. Sitting in Delhi, for example, you don't pick that up, right? Or any other tier 1 city. I think the other thing from nonprofits is just inspiration, right? Hope and inspiration. I mean, that ability, when you have that belief that you can make change happen and you are driving change, and just providing that inspiration that this is how you can transform, a government school, or you can change the life trajectory of a child through better education. I mean, those are so powerful, right? And that leaves a deep impact on an individual when they are exposed to that inspiration. And then the third is, Chandrika and I kind of often are, I think, mind sync, but the third that I was going to use, which she kind of beat me to, is perspective, right? I think genuinely just that broader holistic perspective of what it takes to shift behaviors and mindsets when we are addressing social problems. And there are deep-rooted biases and problems that are very ingrained and that we want to shift, and we all want to kind of make the world a better place, right? But that perspective of what does it take to shift that mindset is also something that I think can be learned from the nonprofit space.
Thanks, Kruti. Matilda.
Kruti, you have picked up everything that I wanted to say. Yeah. So one is that the universal value of equality, dignity, and full potential of all. I feel that is very important, that the corporate sector needs to understand. The other is patience. Nothing is going to happen overnight. It's not an input and output. There are too much for things to happen. And like Kruti mentioned, change is not going to happen till the time behavioral change happens at the ground level. And in a country like India, which is full of so many of prejudices, biases, casteism, the transformation is a 20-25 years agenda, not a 2, 3, or 4 years agenda. So we all need to be very patient. We need to also keep on doing course correction. Other aspect is go out on the field, go and meet the community. It really will change your entire perspective to see the humility and people being so happy with what little they have, and the magnitude of the problem which is there at the grassroots. Yeah, I think more and more CSR heads and people from the corporate should go out on the field and visit and see the amazing work that the nonprofit organizations have been doing. And I think they have realized it, especially during the COVID period, right? During the COVID period, if we didn't have our partners, we didn't have the nonprofit organizations working, putting themselves out there, India wouldn't have been able to, be that successful in getting out during the entire pandemic crisis. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Matilda. So we do have series of queries that are there posted on the Q&A chat. I'm just going to pick up a few. And this is from Disket Anmo, who asked, this question is for all the speakers. So whichever one or more of you share your thoughts, please. Since the focus of NGOs is usually on increasing impact, doing the work and juggling multiple tasks with limited resources, and NGOs are often struggling with work-life balance themselves, what are the few things you may have come across that helps strike a balance between doing work and maintaining processes, formal reporting, etc., especially when it comes to data management and generating program reports, because that's extremely time consuming.
I'm happy to take that.
Sure, Chandra.
I think, I'll speak for Antara. So we have about 8 districts. We work with in mostly tribal populations, and with the frontline health workers. So there's a lot of different kinds of interventions, a lot of different kind of data we need to capture. So we invested very early on in a fairly sophisticated, not expensive, homegrown M&E system, and built that out fairly quickly. But it is, so we obsessively track everything, all programs, all literally everything that our colleagues do on the ground. And I think it's an investment that didn't cost us that much. It took time, of course, and it's taken time in terms of getting everybody in the organization used to it, used to that idea of sort of reporting what they're doing and what their activities look like. The payoff, I think, is incredible, because when it comes time to generate reports and showcase work, it actually becomes much, much simpler, because we don't have to go back to first principles and say, okay, now we have to prepare a report. It's kind of just a question of putting together things that we need to do for our not just for our donors, but also for our board, for everyone that we are interacting with. So I think that is what we've done. And the only message I want to leave here is it doesn't necessarily mean a huge investment of resources. We've used a lot of open source technology, and I think technology is key here, because you can actually leverage today, and especially today. I don't think this would have been possible about a decade and a half ago, but I think today, given what is available in terms of open source technology, it's actually possible to do something like this, and it really pays off.
Thanks, Chandrika. Nidhi, I'm sure you want to add on to this.
Yeah, I was unmuting myself. I think I'll just I completely agree with Chandrika. I think technology is the thing. We being the biggest software provider for nonprofit organizations, we see that how some basics really can help in efficiency. Automation really helps. Yes, some may take some extra resources, some are not that expensive, but yeah, that's the way. I think well-defined processes and supported by technology in terms of digitization and automation will definitely help us to create that kind of a balance.
Thanks, Nidhi. Okay, moving on to the next one. What do the panelists think of the social stock exchange? Views on that? Matilda, would you like to go first?
Yes, so I think it's a good platform. It's different from what the social stock exchange is in other countries. Actually, primarily it's the nonprofit organizations who can list the projects on the social stock exchange. Yes, there'll be initial hiccups where you have a social auditor who will basically, you need to get certified, and then you have to get your organization first registered. Then after that, you need to also get your project listed on the social stock exchange. But once you have the project, right, in a short period, like how you have in a normal IPO listing, you can get a good subscription for your project. But like I said, there would be some sort of initial work that will have to go in terms of doing the normal fundraising, trying to solicit and garner support for your project. So many NGOs are saying that what's the use of having a social stock exchange if I could just not put my project on the social stock exchange, and the retail participants could subscribe to the projects. But the social stock exchange, the BSE and the NSE, they still want to keep the similar governance structure instead of trying to create a very separate governance wireframe.
Sorry, we lost you, Matilda.
The social stock exchange. But happy to take this conversation. Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I'm like I said, it's a very it's a larger complex conversation. So if anybody wants to directly reach out, we recently had a webinar hosted by Hemant Gupta from BSc to address these questions. So we have also tabled the observations and the Q&A part of that particular session. So happy to share it with whoever is interested in.
Sure. Thanks, Matilda.
If I can just add one small thing, I think, we've started seeing a lot of innovations in this space in terms of the way that funding works. So there's a social stock exchange, there are development impact bonds, there are a couple of development impact bonds that have happened, and we're participating in one now. I think a couple of things are important when we think about these new innovations in funding, right? One is just being able to share what's worked and what hasn't worked and the value of that particular instrument, right? So for example, there are costs associated with participating in a development impact bond because you have a number of consortium members and things like that. So, the natural question is, why would an organization do that? So I think being upfront about, what is the value that something like this, an innovation could bring, because these are also experiments and these are things that we are trying as an ecosystem, as a broader ecosystem. I think the second thing is sharing early success stories, because again, as we are experimenting and we are testing this out, many of us are incredibly well-intentioned and we want to really give this a go and see what impact this will have on the ecosystem. So we should also kind of be open to share early success stories and then also look at ways in which we could kind of continue to iterate and improve that particular instrument. I just wanted to say that.
In fact, Kruti, you can also take this this particular question from Soumya Suresh, who says, would love to get the panelists' thought on how we make working in the non-for-profit sector a sustainable career choice and attracting talent with competitive offers. And I know Chandrika, Kruti, all of you have spoken about the importance of talent in culture. So
I really think we need another webinar for this.
Yeah, well,
but, compensation is compensation is a huge one to address, right? And the way that we've addressed it is through doing, looking at benchmarks in the sector, leveraging other kind of third-party studies, doing our own benchmarks. I think compensation is always a huge driver and kind of something that creates reluctance to actually kind of make that leap and join the sector, because sometimes the amount of reduction of pay can be quite significant. So to make it sustainable, I think a couple of things, right? One, nonprofits have to be clear and communicate what their compensation scales are, and not just compensation, but also benefits, right? And then that individual kind of takes an informed decision, because compensation is not just cash in hand, but there are many other things associated with it. And then I think, apart from that, there is the conversation that one must have with funding agencies and donors, right? Because oftentimes there is a lot of pushback in terms of, why is your salary, why is that individual salary so high? And then, elaborate conversation about, the benchmarking that was done to justify that. But there is this sense, I think this is what Nidhi was saying, that, everybody kind of should volunteer and kind of get minimum wage, which is not sustainable. And so, and there is amazing talent, very well qualified talent that's joining the nonprofit space today. And if we need to be able to sustain the kind of quality that we're seeing our nonprofits deliver, we need to be able to justly compensate them for the skills and talent that each individual brings. So there are two things. I mean, the second one I think is a critical one. And we've had instances where we've kind of pushed back and then we have had that meaningful conversation and helped people understand where the skill sets are, and then that's resulted in a change in mindset. But I think that's quite critical.
Sure.
Yeah, I couldn't agree. Just to add to Kruti, I think it's a very, very important and a very difficult problem to solve for a lot of also medium-sized nonprofits. But I think there are two things here. One is there is the sustainability for the individual in terms of a long-term career. And one way in which I think we try and position is to take away a little bit the permanence of the decision. I think if it is, what we try to offer is come and try this out and see what it is like. And then, there's always a path back if it doesn't work. So I think we have to be open to that it becomes a much bigger decision if it's a permanent decision of moving from the corporate to the nonprofit sector. Whereas if it's an experiment or if it's something that you want to experience for a few years, it does two things. First, it helps the individual figure out if this is really something that is their calling, if they want to do this. And second, also it helps them understand the terms on which they're willing to make that choice. And I think both of those are very useful. So in general, I think if there's any way in which we can lower the costs of people transferring across sectors, either way, I think it's a useful thing to do.
Thanks, Chandrika.
Can I just add in here? I think it's not necessarily the ones who are transitioning from the corporate sector, but I generally think that everybody in the nonprofit space should be paid, a good salary when you're working on, national agendas and solving social problems. So don't have that narrative itself saying that non-profit hai to hum log kam pay karenge. Why are you doing it as founders? Why can't you, also, yes, I understand. Now we'll get back to the funding aspect. But if you are at the start itself, you will start, discounting it, saying that just because it's a non-profit, you are expected to really come at a rock bottom where it's difficult for you to sustain in the first place and there's no permanency. Then it's a vicious circle, right?
Yeah, absolutely, Matilda. And I think
coming from the corporate sector, I'm talking about pure
the development sector,
working in the non-profit sector.
Absolutely. And I think, to that point is absolutely well taken. And I think, we make it a point actually to pay quite well in absolute terms. But I think the question was about, the sustainability for people who want to make that, make that long-term their career. And I think it is actually something which is a reality, unfortunately, for a lot of organizations. And that is linked to funding. So we have to deal with that reality.
I see the next topic for the next webinar already.
Yes.
Also just one thing is that if there can be a cost appropriation, so project level cost, the entire cost has to be taken by, whatever project has been supported. And we take even the senior management or the corporate office cost. But currently we're doing most of the cost, but it would help if the nonprofit organization has some sort of a cost appropriation, policy in place.
Thanks, Matilda. Nidhi, maybe this is the last question that we can take. And I would urge all the participants, if there are further questions, to kind of ping. We'll see if the panelists can get back with their answers offline. So Nagesh has asked, how can NGOs share best practices so that the whole sector grows rather than spending resources to create something which already exists?
So I think more conversations is the way, right? Because we all are doing some wonderful work. We all have our learnings. And if we can, like any other sector, there are gaps when it comes to coming together and having a conversation, right? Because I also don't blame anybody out here, because the problems that we are trying to solve are so intense and deep that there is no time to learn from the others. Right. So I think there has to be more initiatives. ISDM is doing some great work in bringing organizations together. Right. So I think a little bit more of sharing, and also with a lot of growing, there is also a lot of sense of competition coming between nonprofit organizations. Right. So since we are trying to solve such large issues, can we not make it competition, but can we make it that we are in it together? Right. And I think, yes. So if we know something, can we share with others? If others know something, can they share with us? And we should be open to learning from the others. So a little bit more internal sector communication would really, really help out here, and not seeing each other as a competition.
Thanks, Nidhi. So we've run out of time, but I think that's what these conversations do. There's still so much ground to cover, but so many open insights. I personally have taken away such lovely insights from each one of the panelists. It's been a wonderful conversation. I would like to thank Matilda, Nidhi, Chandrika, Kruti for this engaging conversation. I already see some pings on the post asking for Matilda, the webinar of Hemant and other cost appropriation policy and whatnot. So happy if you can take it forward. through LinkedIn, your handles, whichever way you feel is the best way of sharing this information in keeping with what we spoke about just now. Let's share all the good practices and best practices. And again, thank you so much and wish you a great evening ahead.
Thank you so much. It was a lovely session.
Thank you, Kakul. Lovely conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.